Hi, this lecture is about Henry David Thoreau, and specifically about, I guess it's one of his two most famous texts that he wrote called On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. The other text that he wrote that's very well known is Walden. This one is famous because of its influence in large part. So this is probably the most influential document for Gandhi, maybe aside from religious literature. And then, of course, Thoreau and Gandhi are both very influential for Martin Luther King. The whole idea of civil disobedience, of passive resistance, of the term that I like to use, non-participation, meaning that you can exert pressure on a particular system simply by withdrawing your power from it. These are ideas that are given in Thoreau and have a long and effective history afterwards. And there's an interesting linkage between the non-participation that Thoreau is discussing, which in principle extends quite broadly, but in his text really talks specifically about not paying your taxes. If you wanted to extend that principle more broadly, you could also show Thoreau to be in contact with the labor movement, which starts not too long after he was writing, really, in the United States, and which has always rested on one particular power, which is ultimately the power of the strike. And the strike is non-participation. The strike is a way to interfere with processes, to put pressure, in that case, on an owning class or ruling class, on the boss, by withdrawing your activity from a particular thing. So this is an interesting in-between zone between just letting things go on as they are and actively working to interrupt or destroy them. I mean, this is an active thing, but the action consists simply in withdrawal. Just going to pull yourself out of the system that is a problem. So as usual, I'm going to try and tell you something about Thoreau biographically and something about his historical circumstance, and then I'll go on and try and lay out the basic content. I'll start with a few quotes, and in this case I'm going really close to the notes that I have posted for you, which is this. I'll give you some quotes from him, sort of explain what I think he's saying, and then just list off what I think are his do's and don'ts. His do's and don'ts with respect to participation within large-scale systems, support of governments, support of armies, support of warfare, support of economy. What he wants to think about is, what are all these large-scale systems in which we are involved? How are we involved in them? What do we do which facilitates their functioning? If only, of course, in the smallest, most minute possible way. What are the systems that we participate in? How do we participate in them? And shouldn't we, if we see that one or another of these systems is fundamentally problematic, not just that it doesn't work perfectly, which Thoreau says is to be expected, but that its whole functioning is problematic. When we discern that there are such things, for example, our tax money goes in huge proportion to the defense industry. The United States now spends more with Trump's new budget. I think it used to be 6 times as much as we spend more than the next 6 countries combined. And these are some major military powers, right? I mean, that's got to include Russia and China. And now it's up to, with Trump's new budget, it's going to be up to the next 7 countries combined. I think that's the statistic. At any rate, we put a tremendous amount of money into our military. And our military carries out operations all over the globe. So recently you might have noticed that some special forces personnel were ambushed in Niger, and everybody got all worked up and surprised, like, whoa, geez, what's the American military doing in Niger? Well, it's doing the same kind of thing that it's doing in every single country in Africa. We are supporting the Somali bombing of Yemen. Prior to the Somali bombing of Yemen, we were bombing the hell out of Yemen by drone. We're destroying civilian populations in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And then, of course, our economic systems involve a whole lot of outsourced offshore labor. So, not this hoodie, because this is a union jacket and made in the U.S., but probably this hat, if I look where was it made in China. What are the working conditions like in China? Well, just way shittier than most of the working conditions in the United States. And why do people make things in China? Because the working conditions in China are way shittier than other places. That is, the Chinese workers are prohibited from having unions. They live in squalid conditions. They get very little pay. And this is the circumstance that international capital prefers. Insofar as I bought this hat, I actually bought it for my kid and then it didn't fit him, so now it's mine. Insofar as I purchased this thing, I'm taking part in a system which is clearly problematic, which clearly trounces the rights and the quality of life and the material well-being of whole continents of people. And yet you go on buying stuff and I go on buying stuff. The Thoreau sort of attitude towards this is like, well, maybe you ought to start thinking through, just start thinking through the systems that you're a part of and the things that you support and see where can you withdraw, where can you cease to participate with respect to the wars. He suggested that we not pay our taxes, and he does acknowledge towards the end that not paying your taxes can have serious consequences. And his comment on that is simply like, well, it's really not possible to be ethical and to be comfortable at the same time. I think we live in a weird situation, probably not unprecedented. I'm often reminded of the Roman Empire when I think about the United States, and especially now that we have Donald Trump in office. I think of characters like Nero and Caligula, these kind of like mad, privileged princes who used their position of power exactly to suit all of their whims. But anyway, the parallel with ancient Rome is that probably in that case as well, many people preferred comfort over rectitude. They preferred to be comfortable, and they didn't bother to think too much about, what were the overall enterprises in which they were involved. Of course, ancient Rome was a slave state. But this doesn't mean it's impossible. I get this from students a lot. Well, there's just too many damn systems, and they're all like, unjust or problematic at some point or the other, but like that's all there is. And so wishing to withdraw from them is some variety of utopianism, wishing for a reality that just doesn't exist. I'm not sure I'm willing to go that far. It may be the case that we cannot withdraw ourselves entirely from systems that produce evil, but that's not to say that we couldn't withdraw from one or two or four, or try and find a path of life, try and find a livelihood, something to do with your life that actually contributes to better systems and tries to back off our participation in worse ones. That's the basic ethical demand that I think Thoreau is making in this text. All right, so let me back up and tell you a little bit about him. So Henry David Thoreau was a New Englander, part of a group of people referred to as the American Transcendentalists, which for the most part is really just Henry David Thoreau and a slightly older good friend of his named Ralph Waldo Emerson. You could look at them as a part of the Romantic movement as that appeared within the United States. For example, Thoreau's experimental year where he goes to live simply and off the land and without dependence upon technology and all that sort of thing. That's a romantic attitude. The idea that there's something wrong with city life. There's something wrong with industry. These don't have to be like really abstract wrongs. Industry fills up cities with pollution. It sucks to live in pollution. It's much nicer to live in the countryside where the air is clean. That's a basically romantic sentiment. That's one portion of the character of Thoreau and Emerson. They were interested in the idea of the unity of humankind, and they lived at an historical point where, because of the expansion of especially French and British colonialism, a whole lot of Eastern religious literature had found its way into Western academies. And so, probably starting with like Arthur Schopenhauer or something around 1800, Western philosophers started to pay real attention to Buddhist and Hindu Taoist texts. And the Transcendentalists were really influenced by that stuff. There's also a mixture, even those religious texts, Hindu, Buddhist, etc., they have a genealogical relationship to ancient Roman philosophy and ancient Greek philosophy. And within that philosophy, you can find Stoicism. And Stoicism also likes to think about the unity of the cosmos. Maybe it's that the entire world is one being, and within this being, we all think ourselves separate, but really we're unified. There's this kind of like background philosophy going on with Emerson and Thoreau. But they also apply themselves to more practical things, especially Thoreau. Okay, so let me tell you about this text in particular. We're in the 1840s now, and the next thing that we'll read will be Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. That was 1848, and I believe so is this Thoreau text on the duty of civil disobedience, 1848, in the United States. He's in New England, and he has two particular problems which he is responding to in this essay. One of them is the so-called Mexican-American War, which came about because, probably under the influence of slave states wishing to extend the power of the slave states by making new territories eventually to enter the United States as slave states. So one force driving the pushing of settlers into Texas was the need of slave states to expand their territory, because the manner of agriculture that the slavers were engaged in was fairly primitive, and it required, well, primitive is a harsh word maybe, but it was land exhaustive. It needed a lot of land, and it tended to use up land and need to expand its land. Of course, there are multiple reasons driving settlers into Texas, but American settlers end up in Texas. And then, of course, they end up rebelling and declaring that Texas be its own country. And the United States backs this stuff up, and we move in and take over the land that you and I are sitting on right now. Is the result of an expansionist movement that begins around the time of Thoreau, and which takes over this land. He thought, totally unjustly, he thought that the seizure of land from Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, California, was nothing but theft. And we could talk about it in terms of the liberty of the homesteaders, but there's probably a lot of lying going on there. You know, even if you go back to Thomas Paine already thought that the United States would ultimately encompass the entire continent. There was this idea about manifest destiny, about westward expansion, about making the country span from sea to shining sea, which was on the agenda for generation after generation of policymakers leading up to 1848. So they wanted that land, they were going to have that land. And the same thing is true about the takeover of Indian lands, which weirdly Thoreau didn't seem to have much problem with, because if you look carefully at duty of civil disobedience, you'll see him early on talking about, you know, the government and how governments don't do anything, people do things. And then he's talking about achievements, you know, good things that are achieved by people. And he's like, the government didn't do that, people did that. And among them is settling the West, as if settling the West is just a good old plain back to nature American thing to do. But at the same time, Thoreau and Emerson both wrote letters complaining about the treatment of Native American people, especially Cherokees, in the years before this. So anyway, you know, Thoreau is engaged in some personal contradictions, in some ideological contradictions. Nevertheless, his antagonism to the Mexican-American War was probably pretty well based. He thought it was nothing but territorial expansionism, and he was opposed to it. It's like, why should I support a government that's engaged in acts that I know to be fully unjust? If I just sit there quietly and let this stuff go on, aren't I then responsible for this injustice? But I don't want to be responsible for this injustice. I know what's right and what's wrong. I know that land that belongs to others does not belong to me and ought not to be taken. I know this. So either I mean it about my understanding of justice, in which case I am required to distance myself from the United States government, which is involved in this territorial expansion, this destruction of many, many lives, and its robbing of resources, and its total destruction of Native American peoples. Either I let all that go on, and at that point I make my own idea of justice bullshit. So I admit to myself that I am a liar. That when I say that things matter quite a lot, I actually mean they don't matter enough to alter my pattern of life at all. So I'm a liar. If I want to be consistent about my real understanding, and especially my ethical understandings, I have to follow through on my principles. I can't just say, hey man, I'm opposed to the war in Afghanistan. I'm opposed to the war in Iraq. I'm opposed to the playing with war with North Korea. I'm opposed to the expanded United States presence in Syria. I'm opposed to the Trump administration's backing off of regulations about the use of bombs and firepower in Syria, such that more and more civilians get killed. I can say all this shit all day long, and I think this is basically what liberal professors do. But if I don't act, if I don't find some way in which to at least withdraw my energy and money from these efforts, then I'm a hypocrite. Then I'm just full of shit. And this is the problem with liberals. And I can say this not as a liberal, because I do not consider myself one, but a good number of my friends are liberals. And so, these are people who are close to me, and I have a criticism of them, which is that they hold on to principles, and they do so adamantly in conversation, and yet their actions, insofar as they continue to work for corporations and any number of other things, their actions do not match up with their principles. Better, I suppose, to be somebody who says, well, the United States is better than other countries, and that's why we can bomb the shit out of them. In a certain way, better to be that person, at least whose principles are in connection with their actions, than to be the one who says, no, I know everything is wrong, I'm against it. And then they go about their daily life in exactly the same way as everybody else, allowing the system to continue. So item number one that Thoreau was opposed to was the territorial expansion involved in the Mexican-American War. He should have been opposed also to the westward expansion, which, I guess the difference is, westward expansion in Kansas or something wasn't taking money from another state that was recognized as a sovereign state on a modernistic model. It was taking land from pre-existent peoples, indigenous peoples, and I think Thoreau was probably guilty of racism on this front, because he did not think of their territory as theirs in the same way that he thought of Mexico's territory as Mexico's. He recognized the rights of the nation state, but he didn't seem to recognize the rights of tribes, which in principle I think ought to be no different. So he fucks up a little, but he's still got this very strong moral position. And then the other issue that he is primarily concerned with is slavery. So it's 1848. We haven't got to the Civil War yet. We haven't got to abolition. And of course, after abolition, we're just going to get Reconstruction and then Jim Crow, which is going to take us right up through the 1950s. And you can ask how much, we're going to spend a lot of time on the 1960s in this class. So you can ask whether, 1970 to 2017 is really different than the rest of this history that we're looking at, which puts people of color, and especially African American people, at this absolutely low, dehumanized position and treats them totally differently and so on. You can ask how much this is different. We don't have slavery. So about slavery, Thoreau was opposed to slavery. A lot of people in New England were opposed to slavery. They had the luxury of being at a distance from slavery, and so, like many Americans today, they could, like the Americans like to pick on China. Like, well, thank God we live in a free country, because in China, everything's totalitarian, and people are not allowed their freedoms, but we got freedoms, and so we're good, and they're bad. Now, this is the way that Northerners like to talk, maybe without the super Midwestern accent I just gave you. This is the way that New Englanders liked to talk about the Southerners. Like, those slavers are barbarians. We're so much more morally advanced than them. And Thoreau has a response to this, which is the one that I was just giving you about the difference between words and actions. He's like, okay, you should probably either shut up or put up. You should realize that just because you say you're opposed to slavery does not mean that you are in any way interrupting slavery. And in fact, here's his point. He's like, northern manufacturers used southern cotton. They used agricultural commodities produced by slaves, and they had to use them. In a capitalist logic, they had no other choice, because they had to buy the materials that were cheapest. If you go and buy really expensive materials when all your competitors are buying cheap materials, you'll run out of business. You'll go bankrupt. Capitalism demands that all producers use the cheapest materials on the market. And this is what manufacturers in New England were doing. And by doing that, they were supporting slavery. Had agricultural production with the use of slaves produced commodities that nobody would buy, it would have ended on the spot. There would have been no purpose anymore. But of course, people all over the world wanted to buy this stuff because it was cheap. Because, you have to put in various elements of capital in order to produce anything, right? You have to get the land, you got to get the seed, you got to get the water, but usually you have to pay for labor too. You don't do much better as far as labor costs than slave labor. Although, maybe there are ways that are at least as efficient, because the problem with slaves from a slaver perspective was, well, you still had to house and feed them, right? Damn, it's too much for them. Anyway, slave labor was good for capitalism, and slave labor was effectively affirmed by manufacturers in the North buying from slave states. So this is Thoreau's point. He's like, look, we've got this expansionistic war, and we've got this slave system. It's like, these are not just little glitches. These are not just small things that, like, you know, somebody made a little mistake and the system's imperfect, we're going to need to fix it over time. No. These are grand evils. You know, like hostile takeover of your neighbor's land is not just an error. It's trespassing. It's violence and the raw use of force and the philosophy that might makes right, and therefore the jettisoning of rightness as any kind of guide. It is immorality incarnate. And of course the same thing is true about slavery. Slavery is not just like, oh, people didn't really know back in, 1848 that black people were humans. It's not like that. It's not like, it just took the white people a long time to figure out that the black people who were working for them were not actually inferior and didn't need to be guided by a superior intellect. It's not like they didn't know that black people were people. Of course they knew black people were people. They just were in a position of power where they were fully capable of dominating them. And then they served themselves. They made themselves feel better with an endless recitation of racist recipes, explaining to them why all this was okay. Slavery is a systematic evil. It's not a glitch. Territorial expansion, unjust wars are systematic problems. They're not just glitches. So these are the sorts of problems that Thoreau thought that we ought to deal with. So now I thought I would move on. So I'm basically just going down the notes here. Let me read 3 or 4 quotes that I think are really good and that summarize in a lot of ways what it is that Thoreau wants to say in this essay. Don't lend yourself to the wrong you condemn. So if you are really opposed to something, and by the way, there is this sort of insistence that humans, as free-willed, rational people, we have an obligation to think through our obligations. We have an obligation to think about what's right and what's wrong. Maybe not to follow what the church tells us is right or what's wrong, or even what our parents tell us is right and wrong, but we have to determine for ourselves what we think is right and what's wrong. And it's very hard to arrive at any kind of honest position where you can say, well, it's totally right for our country to take over the land of other peoples. It's really hard to conscience that ethically. It's really hard to arrive at a position where you're like, yeah, the ownership of other people as property and the persistent whipping and raping of them in order to derive a consistent profit and make a nice life in the plantation house, that's okay. It's really hard to arrive at that position. So first you have an obligation to actually think through in your own mind what you know is right and what you know is wrong, and then don't lend yourself to it, meaning don't contribute to it. If the Chinese system of labor, which so disrespects the Chinese laborer, is fundamentally wrong, and you know that, maybe you should try not to buy stuff made in China. And of course I say this while I'm wearing the hat made in China, right? So I'm not claiming that I'm the perfect one or the ethical one here, but I'm trying to point out that we are all already involved in systematic problems. And I think what we need to do is weed through them and start to think, okay, how am I involved in, where? It's not that I can get myself free. It's not that I can be pure in this world of interlacing systems. It's impossible to be pure. But I can be making a movement in the right direction. I can start thinking, okay, what all am I involved in and how do I pull back? I mean, for y'all getting ready to graduate, taking these last classes because you need the credit, maybe, I would urge you, maybe you should really take seriously the moral dimension the ethical dimension of your career choice. Because I think, to be a teacher is not to be like removed from systems of evil. In fact, as we go on in the next lecture, when I talk about ideology and Marx, I'm an ideologist. I think teachers are involved in producing a consciousness and a submissiveness in people, which is absolutely essential for the system to continue. So education's a problem, teaching's a problem. But I'm not sure, and I can try and unteach. I'm trying to do the opposite of what I'm criticizing. So I'm trying to do with my job whatever I can to pull it into line with what I think is right as opposed to what I think is wrong. But I do think that if I were engaged in a livelihood where I manufactured explosive warheads, I would be much more directly involved in a clear evil. And so my point to you is, if you want to take this stuff seriously, and if you're not going to take it seriously, there's no fucking point in reading it, really. And I'm not sure why you wouldn't take it seriously. It's probably a refusal to think, which Thoreau thinks is the most unethical thing you can do. And I have no respect for that either. At this point, though, in your careers, or as you step into your careers, I think you really ought to think about, how does this fit into the world? Am I generally doing something good, or am I generally doing something evil? It's not like there are no jobs that are less problematic than other ones. Weapons manufacturing is really problematic. Chemicals manufacturing is probably really problematic. Massive pollution is really problematic. The fossil fuel industry is really problematic. The army is really problematic. The police force is really problematic. Teaching in various situations can be problematic too. Maybe you should just think about it. That's my point. Okay, quote number 2. Be men first and subjects afterwards. Oh, this is an important thing. And maybe this will bring me back to one other thing about Thoreau as an individual. Be men first and subjects afterwards. What he means here is that to be a full human being means to be in charge of your own decision making, in charge of thinking through your own decisions, and responsible for your own sense of right and wrong. He thinks that's who we are, that's who we're supposed to be. Most people fail over and over and over to realize themselves as full humans, and it's pathetic. It's depressing. But if you want to be a really full and intact human being with integrity, you have to be that first and a subject afterwards, meaning you have to consult your own conscience before you do what you're told to do. So subjects. Subject literally means subject to the rule of the state, which, for example, historically has had the power to draft people. If you get drafted, the state is telling you, you go be a soldier, you go kill those people over there. We're telling you they're your enemy. And Thoreau's sort of proto-anarchist response to that is, well, actually, there's a law higher than the state. And that law is my own conscience. I know damn well that person over there who you want me to go kill has never impacted me at all. I don't know who that person is. In fact, if I really thought about it, that enemy soldier, he's probably just following orders from his state as well. And this would lead us to a Marxist position, by the way, which is one that I share, which is that almost all wars involve lower class people, subservient people, killing off other subservient people because they're told that those people are their enemies. When in fact, the working class people who are killing the other working class people have more in common with those other working class people in large part than they do with the people who are deciding on the war to begin with. The generals, the cabinet members, Jim Mattis and Rex Tillerson and Donald Trump. I've got more in common with a Russian soldier or a Chinese soldier or an Afghani soldier or a Taliban soldier than I do with Donald Trump. This is a kind of a Marxist point. Thoreau's point is you have an obligation to follow your own conscience before you follow the law of the land, before you do what the government tells you. And you can extend this and realize, what about at work? At work, we're all servile too. This is an important thing to recognize. We supposedly live in a free society where we get to do what we want. But actually, if you look at the majority of hours of your day, that's not true at all. You can't just do what you want at work. You have to work. And if you're caught not working, you'll be out of a job, and then you'll have to scramble around and find somebody else to serve all day long while you're at work. Well, say you're at work and you're given orders to do something that you can't stand. I had a job as a telemarketer. It was like a fundraiser telemarketer when I was in college. It was a terrible job. And I raised money for the United Jewish Appeal and the Anti-Defamation League, because McGarvey doesn't sound Jewish. They made me be Matthew Morris. And I remember at one point there was a text that one of those organizations was, so as a telemarketer you have to read everything off of a script. It sucks. There was one script I was supposed to read that was anti-Louis Farrakhan. I don't particularly have a great love for Louis Farrakhan, because I don't think that all white people are devils, for example. But the way that this text was written, it was itself racist. It was like I was supposed to call people up to raise money, and I was supposed to agitate Jewish/black antagonism, which is probably something that Louis Farrakhan does too. But I was supposed to say, hey, this is Matthew Morris. We've got this real problem. We cannot allow black demagogues like Louis Farrakhan, blah, 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 blah. This was kind of like a scare tactic. And this idea of black demagogues to me, it was using the concept of blackness as like something to scare these potential contributors with. It didn't seem right. And so I was like, I'm not going to read this. No way. This is fucked up. This is not right. Of course, I could just go on to another campaign, and I'm not claiming that I'm like the greatest ethical individual in my hat made in China. But it's an example of the small sort of thing that Thoreau thinks we ought to be doing. We have to be men first and subjects afterwards. We have to consult ourselves and our internal compass as to what is right and wrong, and we should place that above what the government or our bosses tell us. Now, if we did that, things would be a lot better as far as he's concerned. So I said I was going to back up and say one more thing about him as an individual. I think you can make an argument for Thoreau being an anarchist, which means somebody who's opposed to government. And this is because he starts off by saying, I believe that government is best which governs least, and the best thing of all would be to have no government at all, and when we are ready for that, we shall have it. That is anarchism. The rest of his tenor, however, I would say is much closer to libertarianism. So he's got kind of a libertarian streak too. Anyway, next quotation. The bulk of men serve the state, not as men, but as machines. That might be like the core concept in this entire essay. Most people serve their country by thoughtlessly obeying instead of by utilizing their own free will, their own judgment, and their own ethical sense. As machines, we turn ourselves into things. We let other people make decisions for us. And in this respect, we disrespect our humanity. This is his point. And of course, this works for doing what the government says, paying taxes, supporting the military-industrial complex. It corresponds to patriotism. There's two different models of patriotism here, which Thoreau is discussing. We typically think of patriotic people as people who fly flags and support America one way or the other, right? That variety of patriotism, which just says like, well, whatever the government does, I'm for it. Whatever America needs to do in the Middle East, I'm for it because I'm pro-American. That kind of patriotism, which makes no inquiry into whether what America is doing is right or wrong, that's turning yourself into a machine, as he puts it here. Turning yourself into an object or a fool or a child. And what we ought to do is another variety of patriotism, which is extremely rare. The variety of patriotism he would prefer is the variety where I actually consult my mind. I think as deeply as I can. I analyze as deeply as I can what is really happening. I inform myself about like what this war really is, what this social institution really is, what this legislative decision really is. I don't get to put my intellect on hold. I don't get to be lazy. And then I choose the course of action which I think is truly right. That's deeper patriotism. That's really caring about my situation and my country and so on. But nobody recognizes that. Patriotism stays in the common imagination, especially in big countries like the United States and Russia. It remains a thing of obedience and flag waving. Where my mom lives in Grove City, Ohio, every other house has a flag, has an American flag, and the ones that don't have Ohio State Buckeye flags, which is just another variety of kind of herd patriotism. So those kinds of things where you just do what other people do and then think that you're right, that's what Thoreau is pissed off about. The bulk of men serve the state not as men, but as machines. Oh, and then one passing one. The rich man is always sold to the institution which made him rich. So the point here is that the richer you get, the more involved you get in the systems that are dominant within our country, the harder it will be to withdraw from them on the basis of your conscience. So if you really wanted to live a good life, you ought to keep yourself relatively independent of corporations, for example. You should not be seeking maximum profit, because seeking maximum profit will end up by sacrificing your conscience to the direction of your boss. And there's no reason to believe, go back to Rousseau, there is no reason to believe that your boss knows better than you do. Your boss is not a better person than you. Your boss is quite likely a worse person than you, or at best equal. There's no ethical way in which you can say, well, I just trusted the experts here, so I was doing the right thing. No. If you decide to put yourself in a position where you have to follow your superiors because that's how you're going to make money, you have to do whatever you can to maximize profit, regardless of who you hurt along the way. That is the sacrificing of your conscience. And Thoreau has no respect for you in that case. He thinks that you're certainly in the overwhelming majority, but he recognizes, unlike Rousseau, he recognizes that majority rule is not necessarily the best thing. I mean, we don't even have majority rule. Again, think about how many people actually support the tax bill, which is now going through. But even if we did have majority rule, that doesn't mean that the majority is wise. In fact, the majority seems to be typically quite foolish. So here's his overall position, and then I'll just wrap it up with a couple of questions. And I'm just reading the notes here. He thinks that having critical opinions is insufficient. It's not enough. It's not enough to just know what's wrong and to think I don't like our foreign policy. I don't like our labor policy. That doesn't make you good. You need to do more than that. Voting is not enough. A lot of people like to think I got really into, voting this time, and, I really tried to convince people about whoever, and then I went and I voted for Jill Stein. So I'm totally, I voted green. I voted for the good person. Although, of course, she's ruling class, right? She has $40 million or something, but that's not that much compared to all the other rich people. And yeah, Donald Trump got elected, and I thought Hillary Clinton was going to get elected. And in either case, my job is done, right? I mean, I voted. What else can I do? It's not my problem anymore. Thoreau's like, come on. It's still your problem. It's still everybody's problem. And voting is not all that you can do. He says voting is a kind of gaming. You go do one little thing, one time every 6 months or a year or 4 years, depending on how you look at it, and then you feel like you've done your part. You're just lying to yourself. Voting doesn't achieve much at all. Petitioning is not enough. Writing letters begging your representatives to change things. Trying to get somebody else to do it. And these are all very anarchist points of view, by the way. Direct action is the only thing that counts for them. Indirect action, trying to get somebody else, begging somebody else to do things for you, just reaffirms your inferior position, and it's still a refusal to accept full responsibility and to be the one who acts for the good. Petitioning is not enough. And Thoreau's like, I wasn't put here to spend all my life writing letters, begging people. My mom would differ with him. She loves to do that stuff. What you shouldn't do, don't associate yourself with the American government. It's illegitimate. I mean, that's a really heavy, harsh thing that he's saying. Of course, he's saying it, with positive reference to people like Thomas Jefferson. He thinks in a certain way he's standing for what the American spirit really ought to be. It ought to be based on the self-determining individual, the free individual, the responsible individual. But he's pissed off because in practice, that's not what America is at all. So just to go along with what's American, or what the American government wants, or what the American military is doing, is childish irresponsibility. Don't support evil. Don't pay taxes to a government engaged in evil. And actually he did follow through on this. He himself didn't pay taxes for years, and he went to jail for it. Very briefly, and he was bailed out by one of his family members, and he didn't experience anything like what our supermax prisons and that kind of thing might be like. So he was able to say, look, they can imprison my body, but they'll never imprison my mind. He was just uninformed about how harsh state power can get. But he did follow through on his positions. He actually refused to pay taxes because of territorial expansionism and slavery. Don't be a soldier for a government engaged in evil. He's like, this is like the saddest thing that you ever see, is like a bunch of soldiers, many of whom are perfectly intelligent. Well, of course, all of whom are perfectly intelligent, but many of whom have reflected enough to know that, like, yeah, I'm not so sure that this like war that we're carrying out, example, when we invaded Iraq on totally false pretenses. Everybody knew there were false pretenses. There are no weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. We built Al-Qaeda together with the Pakistanis and the Saudis. That's a fact. And a lot of those soldiers heading to that war, they knew. They're like, yeah, in principle, I don't really agree with it either. But they're like, but, you know, I signed up. Maybe they felt that it was their duty. I suppose in the best case, that's what was going on. Not just that they're like, well, I need the money. I'm thinking this will like help me, you know, get jobs in the future. I guess I'll have to go kill some people in an unjust war. Probably some of them thought that, and you can see the ethical problem with that. Some of the other ones probably thought like, okay, yeah, I don't agree with the war. I think this is all bullshit, but, you know, I signed up. I want to serve my country. I'm going to do my duty, and this involves following orders. That's my duty as an American, is to follow orders. And that's where Thoreau just says, no, 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 no. It's not. It's your duty as an American to follow your conscience. It's your duty, regardless of whether you're an American or an Iraqi or whatever. All that shit is second. It's your duty as a man to do what you think is right, to do what you know is right, not to lend your muscle and your mind to the destruction of another people when you know that that's wrong. And it's hard to think when the destruction of another people would be right. Don't participate in any institution that you can see to be evil. So what it is that he supports? Action from principle. That's the thing. Action from principle. He says, he calls this casting your whole vote or influence. And the result of this, he thinks, can be the clogging of the machine. Those systems that are functioning so easily because everybody just submits to them without thought, or because we think that there is no other option, were we simply to withdraw from those processes, everything would gum up right away. So he is calling on us to disobey unjust laws. You know, he was an abolitionist, for example. It's unjust. It's illegal to remove the property of one man and take it for yourself. That's legally what helping slaves escape from the South was. It was illegal. But of course we know that though it was illegal, it was just. So laws and justice are not the same thing. This is going to be the center of Martin Luther King's text that we're reading, the letter from Birmingham jail. It's centered on this distinction between just and unjust laws. Where there are unjust laws, you have to take the initiative to determine whether certain laws, decisions, customs, orders at work, policies are right or not. It is your place to decide. As low as your official position may be, you are all humans, full humans, and you bear this weight of freedom and responsibility. So you should disobey unjust laws. Oh, and by the way, it's not just, you know, the soldier or the worker who Thoreau is attacking, who like they put their effort, they put their muscular effort into following orders from somewhere else. It's not just them who's the problem. It's also all the business people, all the white-collar workers who use their mental ability to do accounting, to do mathematics, to do engineering, to do any number of things, troubleshooting HVAC systems. We think in all kinds of ways. And he thinks there's still something problematic about those people when they use their mind for the task that is allotted for them by their superiors. But they do not use their mind freely. They do not decide what is going to be the enterprise in which they use their mind. He's like, all these people are failing to be fully human. They're not men. They're machines. So I take this to be kind of the final position, that what Thoreau is really pissed off about, what he really thinks like people need to change. It's a police helicopter hanging out over my neighborhood. It's looking for somebody. So, you can think about these guys. And do these dudes really know that the person they're looking for has done something wrong? Do they have any idea? No, they don't know. Somebody just told them. And their orders are to, find and arrest whoever they're told to find and arrest. And we look at them as among the most patriotic people, right? These are real Americans, and they certainly want to believe that they're real Americans, and that those of us who don't like them or who distrust them are like faker Americans or something, that we're not real patriots. But their patriotism, which consists in finding whoever they're told to find, arresting whoever they're told to arrest, without personally having any knowledge about what's the crime, and is this person likely guilty, and what's going to happen to a person just because they get arrested, even if they're let go. They don't think about that stuff. They think it's not their place to think about that stuff. They're acting in a way that plenty of people could call brave. They risk death in certain cases. But insofar as they just take orders, there's a certain cowardice as far as somebody like Thoreau is concerned. So the fundamental thing that he thinks is a problem is not thinking for yourself. And if we were to invert this, we could say maybe the beginning of revolt, well, maybe, first of all, maybe revolt is something that is natural to humans insofar as we have a relationship with freedom, but we have a life where freedom is not realized. Maybe revolt is natural for us. And then the Thoreau part here, maybe the first step in revolt and the first step towards becoming a full human being is to think for your damn self, to not accept the general opinions that are given to us about everything, to not accept the mainstream news account and not accept the fake news account, and not accept just what your teacher says, not just accept what I'm telling you because I'm in charge allegedly in this class. Don't just accept that shit. Think it through for yourself and rely upon the entirety of your experience and your inbuilt capacity to evaluate, reason, and make choices. That action from principle, really thinking things through for yourself and making your own decisions on the base of your own reasoning, that is what constitutes full humans. And the first problem is the opposite of that. It's a servile mindset. The allowance that people make for others and anonymous systems of media and government to determine what they are going to think is true and what they are going to do. That's evil. And when we get to Hannah Arendt, that's basically what she'll say. She's like, you know what? We like to think about Nazis as, the epitome of evil. They're in all our movies. Like, they kind of stand for evil. You can show up that flag and those like very sharply dressed young white men and say like, there's evil right there. And what Arendt will tell us is like, well, maybe that's evil. But it's not evil because of how harsh it looks, and it's not evil because of the allegedly maniacally evil leadership. What's evil is that those Germans just did what everybody else did. They didn't think for themselves. They allowed their duty to be determined from outside. Therefore, they acted like machines instead of like men. And when a whole bunch of people who could be men act like machines, they produce an insanely lethal weapon.